Hello. Well, we want to push ahead, and that is definitely, I think, the right term to use. We were looking at the balancing act that FDR was attempting during the 1930s in regard to Japanese expansion. But it was clear, though, that by 1938, that had failed, and that nothing was slowing the Japanese down. The sinking of the Panay and the apologies of the Japanese meant very little. They continued to go right ahead and continue their conquest of Manchuria and their spread in the Pacific area. By 1939, it was clear to Roosevelt that drastic actions had to be taken. And so the U.S. will now begin to truly squeeze the Japanese economically. The U.S. in 1939 will threaten to institute an embargo against the Japanese if they did not back off their aggression. The Japanese responded by an incursion and invasion of Indochina. The U.S. then issued an embargo of iron, steel, and scrap metal against the Japanese. It didn't slow the Japanese down. And in fact, in a very ominous act on the part of the Japanese, they entered into the tripartite pact with Germany and Italy in September of 1939. The intent of this, although it said that these three countries would agree to come to the aid of the other, if a country not presently in the war got into the war and attacked them, and the only country that of any major consequence not in the war was America, it was an attempt to shore up the Japanese position against the U.S. And certainly the Germans were happy about it, and so were the Japanese. This did not deter the U.S., which now began to consider an embargo against the most precious commodity that we talked about as early as the end of World War II, and that was oil. In the end, the U.S. would have to resort to that because immediately after the tripartite pact, the Japanese overran the rest of Indochina and showed no signs of slowing down. The U.S. then took the drastic step of freezing all of Japan's assets in the U.S. and then ended all shipments of oil to Japan. Well, that last act, the suspension of all oil shipments to Japan, left the Japanese with two choices. One, they could have given in to American demands that they cease their aggressive expansion in the Pacific area. Or they could have started a new campaign. The second choice would be down to start a second campaign, and in this one they would go out to conquer areas in the Pacific that had supplies of oil to get around the American blockade or the American embargo. But the understanding, though, that if they chose the latter, if they chose this new aggressive campaign to replace American oil by conquest of other specific islands and areas, this would ultimately lead to war. So when they decided to choose this course, which they did, and chose not to accept American demands, they were in effect planning for war. From that point on, the Japanese had no intentions of avoiding war with the U.S. And they now played for the right moment. And the right moment, as we know, as FDR would say, following the December the 7th, 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor, was a day that would go down in infamy. It was the day that the U.S. decided that this was now war. So the Japanese took a risk. They had severely damaged the American fleet at Hawaii. But, again, it's sort of typical of what we said about Japanese warfare. Given the lack of resources, the Japanese hoped that by destroying the American Navy in Hawaii, they would cripple the U.S. and be able to at least, if not defeat the U.S. very quickly, to bring the U.S. to terms. Well, like the Germans, they were sadly mistaken. And despite early wartime problems with mobilization, because once this happened, the U.S. now declared war on Japan, and the U.S. now mobilized to fight the Second World War against both Germany and Japan, because Germany 2 days later declared war on the U.S. as a result of the tripartite pact. Despite early problems of mobilization, once the American economic machinery geared up, the end was, as it had been in World War I, was a dramatic success. I mean, if you really, it is the ability of the U.S., and I think it should always be underscored, the U.S.'s ability to move from a peacetime economy to a wartime economy in both wars was spectacular. Once they get going. For instance, when the Japanese cut off access to rubber in the Dutch East Indies and in Malaya, I talked about the fact that the Americans donated enough scrap that they were able to recycle this scrap into 475,000 tons of rubber, which could be used primarily for tanks, which used a ton of rubber per tank. Not only were they able to recycle rubber, but American scientists began the creation of the synthetic rubber industry now. They used synthetic rubber during World War II as well. By 1945, the U.S. had turned out 86,000 tanks, 296,000 airplanes, 15 million rifles, and and 64,000 landing craft, 12,000 ships, and more than 1 billion bullets. More than 1 billion bullets. At its peak, the U.S. built a ship a day and an airplane every 5 minutes. And an airplane every 5 minutes. This is no mean task. And this is what both the enemies of the U.S. in World War I and World War II faced. In fact, we could go back and we could argue this is what the British faced in the American Revolution, was the extraordinary capacity of the U.S. to generate material and supplies. Again, much of that has to do with the U.S. being blessed with such an abundance of resources. It was a thing of beauty once the U.S. cranked up its wartime production. And it was no mean achievement, no small achievement. Generally, there was cooperation between labor unions, and the government. The only, blot on that cooperation came in 1943, when the United Mine Workers went on strike in May of 1943 under the leadership of John L. Lewis. 400,000 United Mine Workers walked out in the midst of war. Lewis explained this to the press, that the United Mine Workers had no choice. The coal miners of America are hungry, they are ill-fed, and they are undernourished, and they had no choice. However, the President Roosevelt thought differently, and in fact took steps to seize the mines and threatened to draft the miners into the army. That seemed to be enough. With that encouragement, John L. Lewis and the president negotiated a settlement very quickly. But even though they negotiated a settlement and the strike was over, I should point out that John L. Lewis was not one of America's most likable people in 1943 and 1944. In fact, Lewis was hated following the strike in many sections of the country. The government also needed cash and money beside contributions of rubber and things like this. And so we have the passage of the Revenue Acts of 1942 and 1943. These acts will create the modern income tax, federal income tax system that I know you love every year. This, under both the 42 and 43 income tax revenue, anyone making $600 or more now, which is a big change, because before the war, almost no one ever filed a federal income tax form. It was essentially reserved for upper income and wealthy people. But now, under these acts, clearly now, it is designed for everyone to pay, I suppose, their fair share. Anyone that was paid $600 a year or more had to file what we know today as the dreaded W-2. Well, when the W-2 went into effect in 1943, I wonder if that was the same year they said that was two certain things in life. One was death, and the other was taxes. I don't know when, but it probably came in 1943 with the Revenue Acts. Yes.
How much did you say that anyone had to earn?
You had to make $600. Anyone who made $600 or above a year, and that was really, I mean, that put it within range of a lot of people. Okay, had to file a federal income tax or a W-2, and had to pay some income taxes. Now, how much money did this generate for the government? Well, look at this. In 1940, before the Revenue Acts of 42 and 43, the government only took in $5 billion from federal income tax. By 1945, the government now took in $44 billion from federal income tax. So I guess the good days were over. It was now time to pay the dues. Okay, so in 1940, they went from $5 billion to 1945 to $44 billion. Well, the draft went into effect, and men between the age, first it was set at 20, then it was reduced to 18, were now drafted, and they were called GIs. Why were they called GIs? Because everything they got was government issued. It was stamped on their gear, so everyone knew it. I think it is important to note, because we have difference of agreements. But once it is remarkable that given the political differences, given the differences we haven't talked about yet in terms of domestic problems within America, ethnic problems, that given all the differences, that once the war started, every group found a way to put aside their differences in some way to join the national cause. And once the nation committed itself totally to the war. Americans perhaps are slow to arouse, and often it seems as if Americans, as the Europeans put it back in the 1920s, they wanted victory, but they didn't want to pay for it. And they may be slow to arouse, but once the U.S. was aroused, Americans fought with everything that it had. I want to look at, as we go through the war, not the battles, but specific incidents, because the Cold War does not begin at the end of the war. The Cold War actually starts during the war itself. Or, in fact, I will argue the Cold War begins even before the war ever started, years before the war ever started, just the same way that we talked about the problems between the Japanese and Americans went back until the 1850s and 60s. The first, I think we can look at the Tehran Conference of 1943. By then, it was clear in 1943 that some of the momentum of the war was shifting toward the Allies. And as a result, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met in Tehran to decide some very basic issues about, one, how to prosecute the war, and secondly, the post-war world. The first question that came up was the question posed by the Russians. You had Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin meeting in late 1943. The question was when to launch a second front. The Russians wanted an immediate second front started because they were facing heavy German pressure. Churchill, however, wanted to delay the second front. The Russians were extremely upset, but in the end, Churchill won out, and you would have the second front postponed until the spring of 1944. And in the spring of 1944, you would have the opening of the second front under the name Operation Overlord in spring of 1944. Well, we'll talk about Operation Overlord in a moment in terms of the actual operation for a second, but there were other issues, very hotly contested issues during the Tehran conference, which, again, you could see some of the signs for the future. There were issues about the future of the post-war world. And on the issues of the post-war world, you could see differences between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, or Russia at this point, and Stalin almost immediately. But you would see Roosevelt compromising to make sure that Stalin stayed a happy camper at this critical junction of the war. The one thing that Stalin demanded, and this is rooted in Russian history. The Russians had been invaded, as I indicated, several times. First by the French, and now the Germans. And the Russians wanted a buffer zone. They wanted to make sure that they were never invaded again, and therefore wanted a buffer zone against another possible invasion in the future. The U.S. supported this in part by allowing the Russians to claim control over Poland. Okay? The U.S. reassured Stalin that they would not interfere with its desire to create this some sort of a buffer zone. So as a result, they almost virtually, or at least that's what Stalin interpreted it to mean, guaranteed that they would have control over Poland and Lithuania. Although there will be some later on, Roosevelt will argue he didn't say that exactly. Secondly, and for some reason the Russians were happy about this, they were happy when Roosevelt indicated that probably when the war was over, the U.S., as they had done in World War I, would retreat back to the continental shores of the United States. That they would not and were not interested in a permanent presence in Europe. Well, Stalin went away believing that that's what he heard. And therefore, when the U.S. and the Allies decided to keep a permanent presence in Europe, Stalin took that as a reneging on a promise that Roosevelt had made at Tehran. Now, of course, Roosevelt had said they probably would not, but things would change by 1945, and obviously the U.S. would have no choice. Well, for some strange reason, and he certainly would change this quite soon, when the meeting was over at Tehran, Roosevelt indicated that the U.S. and Russia were going to get along just fine. That Stalin and the Russian people were going to get along with the Americans just fine. But the truth of the matter is, almost immediately after both the Tehran conference and, as we will see, the Yalta conference, the Russians will almost immediately begin to consolidate their base based on what they perceive would be the exit of America following the end of the war. Well, you do have the beginning of Operation Overlord in the spring of 1944. It is D-Day. It is the biggest amphibious assault in history. On June the 6th, 1944, the Second Front opens with this amphibious assault. There were countless lives lost. But the Allies inexorably and steadily moved forward, eventually liberating Poland and conquering Germany. As they liberated Poland, they discovered what would become an almost endless nightmare of death camps which had been established by the Nazi regime to eliminate the Jews. They came across charred skeletons and mounds of corpses. Some of the corpses were actually living corpses. People had not died. If you've ever seen pictures of the Holocaust, they are unforgettable, as pictures of any attempted genocide of any people are. Well, once Operation Overlord began, it was just a matter of time, as I pointed out. And in February of 1945, flushed from their victories, Roosevelt traveled to the Black Sea coast at a place called Yalta, where he met with Stalin again and Winston Churchill. This conference was a little bit less congenial than the conference in Tehran, because it was clear that the war in Europe was certainly over. There, Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt had to deal with a series of thorny questions that would determine the post-war world. One was the occupation of Germany. In the end, as we will see, Germany would be divided up into zones. Zones that the Allies, the French, the Americans, and the British and the Germans would, the French, the Americans, and the Russians would divide up Germany into zones. And we'll see what happens when the Americans try to consolidate their zones with that of the French and British to create Western Germany, and how Stalin will respond. But they did talk about the occupation of Germany and the future of Germany. They talked about the creation of the United Nations, this organization that they both hoped, the various participants hoped, would prevent a third world war. And then they talked about the status of Eastern Europe. It was clear from the beginning that there were some major differences between Stalin and the Allies on how that should be done. The Russian vision of world stability differed from the American vision of world stability. FDR, and to a lesser extent Churchill, believed that the post-World War ought to be a series of countries that were free to exercise self-determination, countries that will be free to engage in free elections. In other words, they supported Churchill to a lesser extent, but clearly Roosevelt was emphatic about this, that free elections should be held and the people should determine the kind of government they wanted to have. Stalin, on the other hand, was not interested in free elections or self-determination. Stalin was interested in creating a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. Again, this sphere of influence, he argued, would create the buffer zone, which came out of Russia's unique and peculiar historical circumstances. During the conference, the Yalta Conference, they managed to reach a compromise on many of the issues. Compromises that would last all about 24 hours after the conference ended, certainly with Stalin. One of the compromises was that Stalin would enter the war against Japan in 2 or 3 months after Germany's surrender. The U.S. would agree that the Russians would have control over the Kuril Islands in the Far East, and that Stalin would drop a $20 billion reparation demand from Germany. Probably the most successful goal to come out of the Yalta Conference that people adhered to was the establishment of the UN, the United Nations. Stalin agreed, along with Churchill, to meet in April of 1945 in San Francisco to create the United Nations. However, before the conference was over, Churchill, while he did not want to put a damper on the discussions, had to remind both Roosevelt and Stalin that they had ignored and they had not talked about specifically Poland. That there had been some misunderstanding during the Tehran conference about the disposition of Poland. Okay? It was clear that both Churchill and Roosevelt did not mean that Poland would not have a right to free elections and self-determination. Stalin, on the other hand, interpreted that. And indeed, what would happen in the end would be vague kind of language that would be incorporated in the Yalta Accords, which Stalin could point to say that this is what they said. He had a right to Poland, and the Allies could, because it was so vague, could point to they had not agreed to the Russian occupation and control of Poland. But Stalin did, and he ignored, and apparently Stalin had sort of a selective memory, which he seemed to have quite often. Forgot that there was a clause, there was a statement in the Yalta Accords that he agreed that at some point in time, now I guess for him it could have been a decade or 50 years, that at some point, unspecified in time, he would support free elections. Well, everyone left the Yalta Conference with a different view of what had just taken place. FDR left Yalta with the mistaken view that he had laid the foundation for world peace. As he put it, we are absolutely certain that we have won the first great victory of peace. Well, to some extent, Roosevelt has to put the best face on the bad situation. While he certainly wanted free elections and self-determination in Poland, the reality was the Russians had already occupied Poland. They had also occupied Czechoslovakia and Hungary. There was little that they could do. They couldn't turn right around and declare war on the Russians because they still had to defeat the Japanese. So, he will leave Yalta, and maybe that comment about he taking the first step for peace was something that he had hoped but really didn't believe. When he left Yalta, Roosevelt was not feeling well. He said that he felt weak. He felt ill. And when he returned, they went straight to Warm Springs, Georgia, where he had gone when he to recuperate from polio. And while he was there, on April the 12th, 1945, he slumped in an oversized chair. And he told one of his aides that I have a terrific headache. A few hours later, Roosevelt died of a cerebral hemorrhage. What does this mean? I mean, here you have in the middle of one of America's greatest crises, in the middle of a war, while Germany has been beaten, the U.S. still has to face the tenacious and almost unrelenting Japanese army still in the Pacific, even though they had turned the tide against the Japanese by the time he met in Yalta in 1945. But he was now trying to work out with an increasingly now adamant and recalcitrant Stalin. And now he dies. What would happen to America? Well, the one thing I think that his death shows, and keep in mind, here is a man who had been president since when? Since 1932. And this is 1945. It's a long time. And suddenly he's gone. People had come to trust and have confidence in Roosevelt. But the one thing that Roosevelt's death reveals, as it has always revealed, that the founding fathers had set up a system under the Constitution that allowed for an orderly transition of government, and that the institutions would continue to function even when great leaders passed away, that America would continue to function. And indeed, that is what happens. His vice president, Harry Truman, who at the time was not known as a world beater, certainly was not known to have the charisma, to have the stature, to have the ability to negotiate, the political acumen that Roosevelt has. Truman will have the grit and the intestinal fortitude to take America through the rest of the war and the negotiations with the Soviet Union. In terms of the Germans, the Russians closed in on Germany in April of 1945. And as they closed in, Adolf Hitler decided that he would finally, after all these years, marry his mistress, Eva Braun, and then kill her and commit suicide. This whole thing about people who decide that they don't have any reason to live anymore. and decide that because they want to leave, they have a right to take someone else with them, is an interesting phenomenon that still haunts society today. You wonder if you try to get, and certainly I'm not a psychiatrist, but if you try to wonder what gets into someone's mind, that does a warped or a demented individual like Hitler, who understands that he has only one life to give, and that's his own, his insignificant life, but yet, while he has only one life to live, he has the power to do what? And has had the power to take the lives of millions of people. Does that somehow figure in the psyche of people who feel as though they have a right to take someone else's life even when they don't value their own? That in itself is power. Because if you think about Hitler and the people that he killed, the millions, did he ever think that perhaps this was for him a sign of greatness? Because in the end, while his life was only one, he could wreak such havoc on the world that would last for centuries. Germany surrendered, and the 1,000-year Reich lasted only about 12 years. The war in Germany was over officially in May 7th, 1945. And Germany's surrender now allowed the U.S. now to focus all their attention on the Japanese in the Pacific theater. By 1945, they had already destroyed most of the Japanese Navy in two major engagements. And the U.S. troops were now inexorably advancing on the Japanese mainland in a series of bloody battles. Then the war will take a sudden turn. For some time now, discussions, rumors that the U.S. had been developing a weapon of great destruction, the so-called Manhattan Project. Truman becomes aware of the weapon and decides to use it. There's been a great deal of discussion about whether or not the U.S. had to drop the atom bomb on both Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Truman argued, well, he argued several things. One, he argued that even though the Japanese would ultimately be defeated, given the Japanese warrior spirit, and it was formidable, that the military caste in Germany gave no indication that they were about to surrender, and that they would have defended Japan to the very last soldier. Even after the first dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima, the military does not give any indications that they are going to quit. So in the end, Truman will argue that the bomb was dropped to save American lives. And certainly, there's no doubting that it did. So on August the 6th, 1945, the Enola Gay will drop the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. And Hiroshima was chosen specifically. Oh, the other reason why. Because this whole thing is interesting, the drop of the bomb. Now, some people argue, why didn't Truman just... Well, he did tell the Japanese that they had to surrender or they would face utter destruction. Okay? People argue, some argue, well, why not give a demonstration? Why not show them, what we were capable of doing with the A-bomb, with the atomic bomb, equivalent to 20,000 tons, 20 million tons of TNT. And then the hydrogen bomb in 1950 will dwarf that one. The problem was, what would happen if these were, while they had been tested, could you be sure really how they would work under what? Under actual conditions. What if the bomb was a dud? I mean, seriously though, they gave consideration to this. Would that not only give the Japanese even greater, incentive to continue the war? If it didn't work, then nobody would know the worst about it anyway. But it worked, and they chose both Nagasaki and Hiroshima because they were wooden cities. And because the atom bomb could be described as a fireball, that the wooden cities would burn very quickly and do great damage. In Hiroshima, 100,000 people died. You should, if you want to read a book on what it was like for the majority of, for survivors of the Hiroshima bomb, you might want to read John Hershey's book, which is a small book I've assigned before, called Hiroshima. It is not a pretty weapon. And not only is the weapon itself not pretty, but the after effects of radiation. It talks about 8 lives of people, of Japanese, who were there. And how you could see, sometimes it's graphic, you could see, they talk about the skin simply just melting off of people. And how it was so hot, it was like the equivalent of a sun. And that people who were standing, it was so bright that it burned into the concrete their shadows forever. Yes?
So Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not chosen because they were like military areas or anything. It was because they were wooden cities?
Well, they were chosen primarily because where they were located and the types of cities they were. For instance, not Tokyo, because Tokyo was made primarily of brick structures. And they knew that there would be less damage done if they were brick structures. They wanted to make a point. The bigger, again, the greater devastation, the more the incentive that the Japanese would have to surrender. I mean, even with the dropping of the first bomb, there was no indication. 2 days later, you would see the dropping of the second bomb in Nagasaki, which was also a wooden city. And so they really went up in flames. They really burned very quickly. In Nagasaki, you lost another 40,000 lives. Of course, then you have to factor in the lives that were lost to radiation. And this would, again, be hard to calculate because people died over years from radiation. But again, at the most, some people put it at 250,000, but still that was less than, but still keep in mind what happened in the rape of Nanking. I suppose, you can look at it 2 ways. The A-bomb is a horrible weapon, but death, in a sense, is death. I mean, you still killed 300,000 people in one campaign against the Chinese in 1937. Okay, and while the one does not argue that anything that the A-bomb was less humane than what the Japanese did. All life is valuable, and all destruction, what destruction is destruction. But I mean, look at talk about destruction. Jeez, I mean, it took, in spite of both Nagasaki and Hiroshima, it took the emperor Hirohito, to convince the military to give up. They still wanted to pursue the war. And the other reason that we'll talk about in a moment, well, Truman also said something else I thought was interesting. Truman said that, well, we spent $8 billion on building this, why not use it? Maybe Truman was just joking. But he did make that comment. It is, though, the devastation of the war, of the bomb, that will bring the war to a swift end in Japan. But what about the legacy of the war? Some argue, too, that Truman dropped the bomb because of Stalin. That it was clear to him Stalin was not someone that the U.S. was going to be able to deal with. And we'll see that in Potsdam in a moment. And so some argue that the atom bomb was the last act of World War II, but the first political act of the Cold War. That it was used to intimidate Stalin. And in fact, I'll be frank with you, Truman will threaten the use of the A-bomb on several occasions. Very quietly, the Korean War will be brought to an end because Truman will threaten to drop the A-bomb on Korea. Truman, we're talking about personality. Truman was interesting. But the legacy of the war in terms of death was staggering. 400,000 Americans died. 4.28 million Germans lost their lives. More than 20 million Russians, both civilians and military, lost their lives. Some people put it at 25 million. 6 million people who were Polish died. 2 million Japanese died. 15 million people died from the Jewish Holocaust in the entire European area. In fact, 6 of 8.2 million Jews in the German area alone died. Now that's 6 million of a total of 8.2 in just the area occupied by Germany. So the loss of war, the loss of lives in World War II is nothing short of absolutely staggering. And now you had a bomb that could do what? That could duplicate that in seconds. It's funny because Irving Berlin, the writer, wrote a song which Americans began to sing immediately after the surrender, the unconditional surrender of the Japanese and the Germans. This is the last time. This time we will make it certain that this is the last time. For this time we're out to finish the job we started then. Clear it up for all time this time. So we won't have to do it again. That is the way that Irving Berlin saw the aftermath of World War II in this song. But it doesn't finish anything. In fact, as we just pointed out, the Cold War has already begun. Truman, who was vice president, we should look at some of Truman's, I think, personality traits. while he did not have Roosevelt's diplomatic skill, or maybe even Roosevelt's intellect, Truman was a no-nonsense individual. Truman believed that the buck stopped with him. He was a man who was willing to accept responsibility for his actions. In many ways, he was almost as inflexible as Stalin. He could be very inflexible. But he was also very persistent. And Truman had the ability to show opponents that he was serious. Well, we can see that he and Stalin were not going to get along. That was obvious given their personalities. During the closing months of the war, Truman and Stalin and Churchill met at the last grand conference of the three allies in July of 1945. By this time, Truman really did not trust Stalin. During the closing months of the war, you could begin to see tension between the U.S. and the Soviet Union building. This tension would be unrelieved for the next 3 decades. The Cold War became paramount. In fact, the Cold War came to dominate American society, even to the exclusion of domestic affairs, as we will see. But what were the forces that created? I mean, after a while, we'll look at what Eric Goldman says about the Cold War and how it affected every segment of American society, not only in terms of foreign affairs, but what did the Cold War do to Americans? When we look at the McCarthy era in a few years, how did the Americans come to get to the point where they were so absolutely filled with hatred of people that most had never seen? That was an act, as Goldman would tell us, something happened to the American people between the end of World War II and the beginning of the Cold War that would forever change America and the way that Americans viewed themselves and the war. Well, clearly you can trace. There are things with hindsight we can go back and look at that makes it obvious or makes it understandable that the U.S., like with Japan, that the U.S. with the Soviet Union would come into conflict. The U.S. had criticized the way that Stalin had consolidated power in Russia. Stalin was a brutal man. Someone made the comment that the only difference between Hitler and Stalin was the size of their mustaches. That Stalin was brutal, and in the effort to consolidate power through a series of purges, he killed over 3 million of his own people. And in his effort to create collective farming, state collective farming in Russia, that this led to the deaths of 14 million peasants. Here was a man, some Americans argue, that had signed a non-aggression treaty with Germany. How could you really trust the Russians when they flip-flopped back and forth? And once they had signed the non-aggression treaty with Germany, they promptly, Russian troops promptly sent troops into Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. But the Russians distrusted the U.S. just as much. There was mutual distrust on both sides. The rhetoric and the actions of American policymakers appeared to support one of the principal teachings of Lenin Marxist teachings, that there was a fundamental incompatibility between communism and capitalism. That they simply two could not coexist. As early as 1919, the Russians had never forgotten what Wilson had done by sending troops to interfere in their civil war on the side of the Bolsheviks. The Russians are not happy that it took the Americans more than 20 years to give them diplomatic recognition. That is, from 1919, maybe not, but from 1919 to 1933, the Americans did not diplomatically recognize the Russians. By 1945, Roosevelt had changed his mind completely before he died about Stalin. He said that Stalin was as much of a dictator and as absolute as any in the world. Yes.
Wasn't Russia also upset with the fact that the U.S. did not come up with the second front as quickly as he wanted them to?
My next point, exactly. She's made perfectly my next point, that the Russians were upset that the U.S. did not open the second front earlier. The Russians were taking a beating and felt that the U.S. could have saved lives by opening the second front earlier. But the truth of it is, it was the British that really kept Roosevelt from opening a second front. They were also suspicious of the U.S. Here the U.S., and now this is important, here the U.S. has this secret bomb, the atom bomb, and yet the Russians are upset because they don't share their information at all with the Russians that they have this new bomb. Of course, the U.S. wasn't crazy. I mean, she had to be crazy. Well, in the end, as the war comes to an end, it's clear that the U.S. and the Soviet Union now, because it has its satellite countries, it's already invaded, has fundamentally different visions of the post-war world. And this is what creates, for so many years, the fundamental difference that will create the policies of containment and that you have two opposite opinions about the world. Two different philosophies. Despite occasional contradictions, and slips and things like that, we have to be honest. Overall, America felt that its mission was to spread the revolutionary ideology of democracy, individual rights, and open markets. During the creation of the Atlantic Charter, the U.S. stressed the right of countries to choose their own form of government, and that everyone would have equal access to trade and raw materials. This is not something new. If we go all the way back to the 19th century, what was always something the U.S. stressed in its world policy, in its foreign policy? Open markets and equal access. And that aspect of its foreign policy was an extension of what? America's economic prowess. Well, on the other hand, the Soviet Union didn't care about self-determination or free elections, to be honest. The Soviet Union was interested in maintaining a world that was determined by spheres of influence. Its overriding goals, they argued, was to secure their borders from foreign invaders. Almost apologetically in 1941, Stalin made the following comment that all we ask for is to restore our country to its former frontiers. Well, that wasn't true. The devastation, though, of Europe created a void. And the U.S. and the Soviet Union were aware that someone would have to fill that void. And the U.S. understood something else about this void. That what? Well, that's right, that it couldn't be Russia. I mean, that's absolutely true. But they also realized that unlike World War I, there was no going back to isolationism. World War II had destroyed that notion, particularly with the technology of the atom bomb too as well. The odor of death was everywhere. 50 million people dead as a result of war. This vacuum precipitated this historic shift in American foreign policy. Never again could the U.S. retreat to the other side of the Atlantic. It had the world's largest navy at the end of the war. It had the world's largest air force. And for a while, it would have a monopoly over atomic nuclear weapons. And all this was undergirded by its greatest strength, in my opinion, and that was America's thriving economy that put it in a position to fulfill its historic mission. As Truman put it, we are going forward to meet our destiny, which I think Almighty God intended us to have. And we are going to be leaders, he told his Missouri neighbors in 1945. Yet, despite the largest navy, the monopoly of nuclear weapons, the great economic prosperity, the U.S. still could not control events that would shape the coming Cold War with the Soviet Union. Indeed, Soviet Union could boast. In 1945, they too had a 10 million man army that was in complete control of Eastern Europe. That the Soviet Union was in a position, unfortunately, they had gotten in a position by this time to be able to enforce their vision of spheres of influence and these buffer zones by 1945. Within weeks of the Yalta Conference, where Stalin had agreed to hold free elections, Stalin installed a pro-Soviet government in Poland. And then he moved to strangle the rest of Eastern Europe. Country after country in Eastern Europe would fall to Soviet control. Well, when we meet the next time, we'll look at the Cold War and take it up to the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, and then we'll look at some domestic policy as we move on.